The success rate for small businesses is not very good. In fact, only about half of businesses ever make it to the 5-year point. And I want to show you some common financial mistakes that business owners make so you can make sure that your business isn't just another statistic. As business accountants, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. And of course, over the last 18 years plus, we've helped thousands of small businesses and we've seen some very common challenges. And if the owner isn't aware of those challenges, it can kill their business silently. And in our role, it's not just startups that suffer from this. It's actually quite mature businesses that have these issues as well. It just takes the more mature businesses often a little bit longer for them to fail. It's kind of like a slow death. They creep up on you and then RIP, business is gone and it's a sad day. I think particularly the fifth issue that I'm going to show you is one of the most common and it's absolutely within your control to avoid. Now, ultimately, when small businesses fail, it's actually to do with one simple truth, right? They run out of money, can't pay the bills, and it would close. But it'd be a pretty poor video if that was the only insight I could give you. So let me break it down into some more practical and perhaps later on less obvious issues. However, we're going to start with probably the most obvious one. So let's just get it out of the way to begin with. And that's that the business just didn't sell enough. Now, you might be thinking it doesn't sound like a silent killer, but the reason I put it in this video is that often the reason it's silent is because it happens at the beginning. And now, whether that's the beginning of the business or beginning of a new project or service line, it doesn't matter. It's the same issue. And that's that the owner thought sales would come quicker than they actually did. So for example, I can think back to a business we dealt with who had everything they needed in theory to succeed. It was a printing franchise that had worked previously for other franchisees and should have in theory just been completely fine. But it ultimately failed because the owner effectively had overcommitted. He'd estimated what he thought was going to be the income coming in and then taken on things like more staff than needed, rent that he didn't need on a big unit, and he just ran out of money. So the important tactic here, whether you're starting out or whether you're just looking to expand and launch a new plan, is to plan your cash and plan it over time. And this can just be a simple spreadsheet. But the key tip here when you're doing this exercise is to take whatever time you thought it was going to take to bring money in and just extend it, make it far longer. Because it's so sad to see a business that's so close to doing well to just have to close because it runs out of money. I think you've probably all seen that meme online where you got somebody digging for gold and below them there's another guy digging for the gold. And the guy at the bottom turns around just as there's like a thin wall between them and the gold. And quite often that's what we see at small business level and it's very, very sad. But of course, planning this cash flow can only get you so far. You're going to need to learn how to market and sell well, but that's certainly outside the scope of this video. But I can tell you both from experience of doing it myself and also working with clients that it's going to take time, effort, you're going to need to learn new skills, and that weirdly the best time to market is probably going to be the time that you don't want to or you don't feel like you've got enough time. So it's super common in, say, the micro small business world where we work with a lot of one-person businesses, one-person consultants, and they go out this thing where they network hard, they market hard, get their first project, and then they're busy doing the project, and then finally they come out of the project and there's no work and they're really worried again. When really they should have carried on some marketing and networking during the time that they had the busy project and just prioritized it as part of their day. Maybe you've been here before. Now, the second issue we see, whether you're just starting out or whether you're more mature, and it can definitely happen in both circumstances, is that you as the owner takes too much money. And you might be thinking, well, it's too much. And I guess the answer to that is more than the business can afford. And you're probably thinking, but I need to live. And I agree with you, you do need to live. But unfortunately, we live in the world of business ownership. And if the business can't afford it, it can't afford it. We've got to work out how we make that work. And oddly, this is the biggest silent killer we see of a more mature business that's growing fast. So for example, we were working with a small marketing agent and they were doing well. The owner was working like 6 days a week, all the hours, had a bit of initial success. It was going really, really well. They took on a couple more people for the teams, but the business didn't immediately grow its profits anymore. And that's quite a frequent result. You bring people on, actually sometimes the profits drop for a while you get them trained up, and then you have to bring on work to pay their salary and everything else before the owner might see the actual pound figure come to the bottom line of their profit and loss report and ultimately available to take as dividend. And what happened in this particular scenario is the owner carried on paying themselves a good salary, but the profits just weren't there on paper. And this kind of slow decline doesn't happen instantly. Quite often there's money in the bank, so the owner keeps drawing it. But what suddenly seems to happen is, where's the money to pay the suppliers? Where's the money to pay the tax bill? I can't pay my VAT. And then they get into this vicious cycle that can be really hard to get out of. So in order to avoid it, you've got to work out on paper whether the business can actually afford to give you what you're taking. And one of the key ways to do that is to bring up what's known as a profit and loss report. And we've done other videos talking about how to read a profit and loss, but you want to do this relatively regularly. Now, I quite like the idea of quarterly, but you want to be doing it at least annually. I think as you get more mature and there's cash in the bank and everything else, you probably don't see it as urgent. I think when you're really micro or just starting out, it's pretty obvious because your cash is just disappearing. But when you get bigger, it takes longer to see. But I think making sure you're looking at this regularly is really going to help your long-term survival and growth. And what you want to do is look at the profit and loss report. And the figure at the bottom is in theory the profit. Now you need to pick a date where your bookkeeping is up to date and you're happy with it. And then take that figure and take off things like loan repayments, or maybe you've got an old tax debt or something like that. Take off any big items of purchases like computer equipment and all that kind of stuff. Things that aren't shown on that profit and loss report. If you look at it as like an ins and outs, there's going to be some of the outs are going to be missing from that report. So you do all that, and what's left, you want to make sure sure that your pay is not more than that bottom figure. Now, there's far more nuance to that, but if you just did that regularly, you'd come to a bit more of an awareness about whether your figure that you're taking is anywhere near what's actually affordable. And if you really care about this stuff, you would go and get yourself what's known as management accounts, which take into account all the timing differences, such as like unsold stock or work in progress, things that might have a really big difference on that figure you're seeing. But I find that most people just don't even look at this stuff at the beginning. So I'd encourage you to go and do this exercise first before worrying about that next stage. And if you're thinking, Dan, I don't even have a profit and loss, a P&L as it's known, I don't know what to do, then I would encourage you to go and start the journey about getting into some cloud software. My go-to would be Xero, and there's a link in the description with a great discount to help you get going on that journey. And just as a side note, I find often that issue number 5 occurs with this one quite frequently. So stick around for that, because I'd be interested to know if that's happened to you. So the third issue we see quite frequently is that the business owner just made a bad financial decision. Now, what constitutes a bad financial decision is quite wide. And sometimes they're really dramatic and you'll be like, wow. So for example, I had a startup client a few years ago who went and borrowed 25 grand personally to put into the business, because often when you start businesses, the banks won't lend you any money. And he put all that 25 grand straight down on sponsoring an industry event. He didn't gain one lead from that event, and he went out of business 6 months later because he just ran out of cash, didn't have any money to actually spend on anything he actually needed. And you might be thinking, well, I don't know what you do about that. And you're right, there's some things that you just have to shake your head at and think, well, okay, if he discussed that maybe with some business mentors, some other people who've been in business for a while, they might have talked him out of it, but that was his decision, that's where it went. But that's just an outside extreme. Generally, they tend to occur more when someone's made an educated guess of the numbers, mainly because they're not looking at them. So either they don't have any reports and numbers to look at, or they don't know where to look or understand how to look. And they're just living out of the bank account day to day, just looking at it and think, well, that looks like quite a lot of money. I could probably commit to this. So they might decide to hire a new person or take up a new lease on a new unit or something like that. And then they're committed. And again, with the more mature businesses, this doesn't suddenly just happen overnight. They run out of money. Suddenly they get a VAT bill or a tax bill on their desk and they're like, I can't pay it. What do I do? All the supplier bills are building up and you're thinking, where's my money? And everything feels like a grind. And if that's happened quite frequently, it's because we've made some decisions based on this. So it's a little bit similar exercise to what we talked about earlier with the owner's drawing. You've got to know what kind of profits on paper you're making. And this doesn't have to be that complicated. Like as accountants, we'd love you to have really good detailed figures, detailed management accounts as we described before. But actually, most small business figures are relatively simple in terms of once you understand the model, you don't need to get down to the pence, just take some averages. So you could just list out on a piece of paper, but normally in a spreadsheet, what's coming in and realistically what's coming out. And this is the key point, be realistic, because your behavior will not change overnight. The amount of times I've done this exercise with business owners and they say, but that's not true because in the future I'm going to do this. But we know as humans, quite often we're creatures of habit, and this doesn't change when it comes to your spending habits generally. Yes, you can make changes, but I'm sure if you ever tried to be on a diet or change your home finances, you're going to have found it tough, and it's not an overnight thing. So if you always spend 20 grand on rent and staff and accountancies and toiletries and telephone bills and all the rest of it, you're likely to carry on. So just work that out on a monthly basis. What comes in, what comes out, what do I repay in loans, what do I pay myself, and just see what is left before committing to these big changes. And one of these things that you do have to go with, I think, as kind of an entrepreneur or business owner, is you've got to go with your gut some way. And you've got to sometimes look at the maths and think, well, I know the direction of travel. And I've certainly done this before. I've committed to things where I know that technically right now on paper, I can't actually afford it. But if I want to grow, this is what we're going to have to do. And I like that from my clients if it's done properly and with science backed. Sometimes you've got to take some risk. In fact, I'd argue many times you have to take some risk. But doing it with an educated number about what needs to happen for this to be sustainable is really, really key. And as I said, quite often as a business model, you can actually break it down to several key figures once you know them. What is your average turnover for a month, your average sales? What are your average expenses based on your behavior? And some of the other figures, and you can put those together literally on a bit of paper and do that exercise. And perhaps actually on another day, we'll do a video on that. So this next one is what I call margin creep. And this is the slow death. And it's very, very common, mostly in mature businesses. It doesn't very often happen in the startup world, but it begins early. And that's generally what happens is your expenses go up year by year and you just don't react. And if you're not looking at your figures regularly, at least even annually, and comparing what's happened, this will creep up on you. And generally, again, it creeps up on you a little bit like we spoke about earlier. What will generally happen is it might not necessarily be that it's suddenly like you can't pay taxes, but suddenly you just feel like there's not enough money or there's not quite enough money. It just feels a bit tighter. And then if it carries on, you eventually get to that point where there just isn't any money to pay those bills. And then it's hit you, it's blown up. I always picture it like a Minecraft creeper. If you know what one of those is, it's up behind you, then bang, it blows you up. And suddenly you've not got the money you need to pay these bills. And it can happen for loads of reasons. Perhaps it's not just that your costs have gone up. It's that maybe as a business, you've just become inefficient. I don't know if you've ever come across Parkinson's law, but it's this idea that the kind of work expands to the time it's given. And I quite frequently find that as businesses grow, they become less and less efficient because you get more people. And then in theory, maybe there's more capacity or the feeling of more capacity. And and you just don't get the same out of people. And that's not always in all businesses, but you see this trend quite frequently. And again, it's all fixable with a bit of focus, but it's those kind of things that really slow down the profitability of the business and ultimately long-term will cause a business real problems. I think this is particularly important in 2025 as we're recording this video because we've seen employment costs rise so much and the costs of everything, particularly software, have flown up. And the action here is going to be to review this. I think annually is okay. It's quite nice to do it quarterly just to see where you are on some key measures, but actually on the overall pricing, just doing it annually can be a good exercise because again, most owners won't be doing this at all. So do that. And then the normal solution to this is to make sure you're thinking about what you're doing with your pricing, but it doesn't have to be. It could be dealing with costs or efficiency problems, but quite frequently it's going to be a combo of several of those factors. And look, there are other things that cause margin creep, but these are the most common. Now, number 5 is quite close to my heart. And the reason is it's some of the most painful conversations we have with owners, and it's the big killer outside of the number problems, and it affects you whether you're a startup or whether you're experienced. I think actually it's a lot more common in the experienced, more mature owners, but it does happen quite frequently in startups, sometimes as quick as like 6 to 12 months in, and that's that you've just lost the love and the passion for what you do. So for example, the most common version of this we see is that an owner's really grinded hard, they've been doing 60, 70 hour plus weeks for a few years, been all in, really motivated, go, and then they start to get some success, they start to get comfy, maybe they've started to wind down the time they've spent doing actually what made them successful in the first place. So we mentioned marketing and things like that. Maybe they stopped doing as much. Maybe they stopped driving their team and presenting the vision and all these kind of things. Maybe they stopped trying to come up with better ideas, refresh their products or their services. And ultimately, sometimes you hear that it feels like a chore. Now, in our work with owners, we hear these conversations all the time. And then owners are just getting near to what feels like the end. And usually they're talking about either starting something new, selling it, or jacking it all in. But I think that's often because actually, in order for them to get to the next level, it feels really hard. They've already gained the experience they needed to get where they are. And the idea of starting something new seems far easier because they've already gained all the skills they need to get back to where they are. And maybe it's a little bit more exciting. But actually, I think a lot of the time we see more success is someone just hangs in there, deals with the fact that they don't know what they don't know, goes and invests in themselves, gets inspired, gets around other people that are doing bigger things and pushes to that next level. But if it was that easy, I suppose we'd see a lot more bigger businesses. And from our end, we actually see it play out in the numbers, weirdly. Sometimes it's not necessarily the financial numbers. So for example, I've seen a client this year who's had one of the best years they've ever had, but you can see it in other numbers. In this example, like their staff turnover was higher. People were leaving and they just couldn't put their finger on why. And it was the vibe and the culture had just not been led from the top. And they could see that perhaps there was some resentment for the owners appearing to just be chilling, earning some good money. And I don't know, the whole workplace just becomes less productive. Sometimes it's things like that where we see it. Or perhaps their client kind of churn or their customer churn has gone up because they're just not coming up with new ideas and really getting in the weeds to figure out and continually improve. So if this is you, it's going to need a lot more focusing than just on one metric. I think there's a lot of work to do on you internally, and you won't necessarily see in your profit and loss, but you might. But as I said, what we've seen work well for people to kind of rejuvenate them is talking through these issues with somebody that's been through this, or getting out in the world to inspire you, or listening to podcasts or other videos with people that are pumped up about their business. But it is a very personal thing. We aren't robots, so some sort of fluctuation of love or desire and effort is going to be expected. But if you want a clear downward trend, it's something to reflect on for sure. And often we find it's just getting back. Perhaps you need a new goal to get yourself pumped up, to just get back to doing what you were doing before and what got you there in the first place with a new experience spin on it. If you want to hear a story of how one of our business owners went through many of these challenges and turned it to record profits inside of a year by concentrating on just one number, watch this video.